Hello and happy St. Patrick's Day. Welcome to our webinar, Buildings Owners, 4 Reasons It's Critical to Have a Proper Vet Office Lease with Yourself, sponsored by Cirrus and Covetrus. I'm Amy Booker and I'll be your host today. So please introduce yourself in the chat, let us know where you're joining from. And as we normally do, we'll have a question and answer session at the end of today's presentation. Please use the Q&A in your Zoom options at any time during the talk and your questions will get answered at the end of the session. I'm very excited to introduce today's presenter, Matthew Donato. Matthew Donato is a senior healthcare leasing consultant at Cirrus Consulting Group, North America's preeminent commercial real estate and office lease negotiation firm for veterinarians. With a background in small business management and consulting, Matthew helps doctors on a daily basis with understanding the intricacies and impacts of their veterinary office lease and how to successfully leverage the agreement to maximize practice value while limiting risk and liability. Matthew, we are ready for your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amy. I very much appreciate you having me out here tonight. And thank you to everybody here this evening joining us on St. Patrick's Day. So yes, as Amy mentioned, this is the webinar regarding the 4 major reasons that it's critical to have a proper vet office lease with yourself. Right. And now, just as we kick things off here, we're just going to pull up a quick poll just to gauge a little bit about the room, kind of where we are all today. And just a couple quick questions so we can best cater this evening's course. So I'll leave that up there for a couple moments and then I'll get started. Excellent. So just to get started here, I want to give everyone a background about Cirrus, really who we are, what we do, and why we're qualified to be here this evening, and give you all a bit of an understanding on why the office lease, and more importantly, the lease for your veterinary practice, especially as an owner-occupant, is so important for you, not only today, but also for your long-term goals and objectives. So a little bit about us. We are a healthcare and veterinary specialized tenant representation firm. We were founded almost 28 years ago now, back in 1994, by healthcare practitioners for healthcare practitioners. And really why we were founded was because we noticed that many of yourselves and your colleagues were being taken advantage of, whether it be by landlords, IRS issues, buyers, and beyond, through the lack of knowledge surrounding the commercial lease agreement. Now, since then, we've successfully negotiated and created over 12,000 veterinary, dental, and medical office lease agreements. And really what makes us so unique as a firm is that everything for us is done in-house, right? So we have an in-house legal and leasing team. And now what they do, they're comprised of individuals, some of which who have been with us for over 20 years now, as well as commercial real estate attorneys, and some of those that we actually took over from the major international landlord side. We conduct CE educational seminars annually, both and with the participation in veterinary conferences, such as the AVMA and beyond, right? In addition to that, we are a premier healthcare tenant representation firm for veterinarians all across North America. Right now, really the purpose of today's webinar, as I mentioned, we're really going to be going through the crux of the 4 major reasons of why it's so important to have the veterinary office lease agreement in place. Now, one of which is a balanced and customized approach to the lease itself. Right now, what I mean by that is and I'll get into this in a bit further detail, but what I mean by that is it needs to ensure that we're operating in a fashion in which it makes sense for you, not only today, but for your long-term goals and objectives, and also not to be in a situation for any of you on this evening's webinar that maybe are approaching transition, or if you're looking to sell the veterinary practice that want to retain ownership of the building, it needs to be structured properly and fairly between both yourself and your tenant. In addition to that, obviously, we're going to be going through the importance of the veterinary office lease agreement, really getting into the crux of what it means, how various clauses create different impacts on yourself, And also figuring out what rental rate is the best rental rate that suits you and how to properly structure that rental rate so that it makes the most sense. And of course, we're going to be going through the key terms and conditions within the veterinary office lease. Right? And now, as we're going through here, some of you may be wondering, why does the lease matter when I own the building? And really, that's for a couple reasons. Number one, looking through, it needs to, first and foremost, mitigate your risk and exposure, right? Any of you that may be transitioning and becoming the landlord and moving forward in that fashion will understand that with that, you need to protect your asset. You need to ensure that if somebody else is coming in, that you're protecting that building, your family, and your estate, as well as ensuring for yourself while you're still practicing within the space and are owning the building, ensuring that we aren't coming up with any taxation issues. We don't want the IRS coming to knock on the door because the rental rates are structured in a poor way. Or, of course, we want to ensure that if, God forbid, anything is to happen to any one of you and you're to pass away, what happens with that real estate and what happens to that practice? In addition to that, of course, is the separation of entities. So for any of you on this evening's webinar that own the building and the practice, you should have two separate corporations in place. One corporation that owns and operates the real estate itself, and another corporation that owns and operates the practice. And now the reason that that's important, I'll get into it a little bit further on, is that it really has to do with liabilities, right? How do we separate those entities? If, God forbid, somebody's to trip and fall, what happens? What entity do they come after? Right? And then, as I mentioned a couple times thus far, it's the proper rental rates to avoid the taxation issues. If we're having a situation where we're grossly overpaying in rent and understating incomes, this can become a major issue for any of the IRS and beyond. And of course, is practice sale, right? When we're looking at the valuation, what role does the lease play? Why does that make such a big difference? What do financial institutions require from you, and or what does your buyer require from you in terms of a lease in order to take over that space? And of course, is increasing the property value, right? Any commercial real estate asset is predicated on the lease itself. And the better the lease, the better structured the lease, the more value you're providing for your building and for your location. Right? So getting in a bit further is the key factors of your lease agreement. Right? So as I mentioned earlier, we want to ensure that this is an agreement in which it is mutually beneficial, right? As I said, when we're moving into that full landlord seat and we're becoming the landlord and you now have a tenant that you need to take care of, having something entirely landlord friendly can be good from the perspective that you get to control anything and everything. However, when anybody's evaluating the opportunity to acquire the veterinary practice, it can become problematic for them if the dial is too far on one side. And of course, protecting your assets as a landlord, if we're all the way on the other side where it's too tenant friendly, well, then we're not protecting our asset enough. So really what we need to focus on is how do we protect both of us simultaneously? Then that is really by coming down to a mutually beneficial lease agreement. And what I mean by that is, of course, we're going to continue to ensure that your asset, your practice, your location is always protected. But on the flip side, you need to ensure that there is some leniency and some capability for your buyer or your eventual tenant to still function within the location with ease and not having to have a battle every single time something goes wrong. So really boiling down to it, mitigation of risk and exposure, right? As I mentioned, the separation of entities, practice versus property. There should be two corporations, whether it's a corporation and a trust or what have you. The separation of entities is extraordinarily important to ensure we are clearly aware of who owns what in this situation, right? We don't want to have a situation in which we're looking to sell and somebody is trying to argue for the X, Y, or Z being done at the same time. Additionally, like I said, if anybody's to pass away, what happens? What asset does each party own? How is the ownership of those corporations structured? All of that needs to be clearly lined out so we're always protected no matter what happens, right? And another component here in line with the separation of entities and the mitigation of risk and exposure has to do with lawsuits. Unfortunately, we live in a world where lawsuits are not an uncommon form of activity these days. And really, what happens if, for example, somebody is to trip and fall on the property? Well, who do they have the ability to come after? Obviously, what we want to happen is there to go over the corporation that owns the real estate, not the veterinary practice. Typically, we have a lot more assets and monetary value within our practice corporation rather than the real estate corporation. Usually it's just a holding company or some form of trust, right? So with that, we need to ensure that if somebody does sue, that they can't come after the practice, they can only come after the landlord. And through that, that needs to be clearly delineated through the lease agreement on whose responsibility is what, if, God forbid, something like that is to ever occur. The next component as well is the protection to your estate and your family. And as I mentioned, if God forbid anything is to happen to any of you on today's webinar, what does that look like for your family? Who has the ownership? How are they going to continue to function there? And if that is the case, how are we either A, selling the practice off so that the family can retain income, or are we selling both as a lump sum deal? What does that look like for you? And each and every one of you are all going to have different answers. And that's not a question that needs to be answered today, but it's just a point to ensure that we get the sort of the wheels turning, if you will, because unfortunately it's something that we never want to have to think about, right? We don't want to have to think about ultimate, unfortunately passing away or becoming too injured to practice, but it is a key importance through the creation of a lease to ensure that both things are separate and everybody is protected regardless of what happens in the long run. Then, of course, is the protection of the most valuable asset. Now, this can be argued what we're thinking of, but the most valuable asset typically is surrounding the veterinary practice itself. What does that look like? How are we going to protect it? And that is all done through the lease agreement, ensuring, once again, that everybody's duties and responsibilities are consistently outlined through that lease, as well as ensuring that we're protecting our other assets, which is the property, and getting all of that succinctly and in line with each other, because the last thing that we want to happen is, getting into a form of he said, she said, and we can't decide who wants to do what or whose responsibility is what, worst off. Right. Now, next is the rental rates, and are they in line with the market? And having properly structured rental rates is crucial to the long-term stability and success of your practice of the building. And why is this important as well? Is because if we are, as I mentioned earlier on, if we're overstating our income or understating our income, there can be tendencies for the IRS to take a closer look at how we're operating and what we're actually paying ourselves. Because if we are in a situation where now I'm paying myself $100,000 a year in rent, for example, well, now I'm understating my income by $100,000. Now, I'm sure you can all imagine why that may be a problem with the IRS. There's a different tax bracket, etc., that can come into play. And now you're getting audited. Now you're on their blacklist where you consistently are under the microscope. And number one, that's not something that we want to have to deal with at any event of our life. But also when we're looking at selling, we're looking at passing that along, that becomes a blemish on the record or on yourself. So extraordinarily important that the rental rates are in line with market as well. for those of you that may be underpaying your rent, just going back to paying yourself a couple $1,000s a month in rent. Well, what you're effectively doing there as well is understating the value of your building, right? As I mentioned, any valuation that's coming through, if they're looking at acquiring your building, well, and we're only paying ourselves a couple $1,000s a month in rent, well, now the building is actually worth less because what that income property brings in is significantly less than others within the area. Additionally, why rents are important is if we look at practice sale, is that if we're understating and now all of a sudden we have to jack up the prices, well, any valuation firm, any of the financial institutions, when they're looking at that increase suddenly, now the books are thrown off. Now our income statements, balance sheets, and beyond are all different than what we had previously been seeing within the practice for the past 10, 15, 20 years. And so rental rates are extremely important. And I know none of us want to think about, oh, I got to pay this or and beyond, but it's going to yourself. We need to ensure that we're doing that properly. And with that in mind, some of the most common errors that I see with many of your colleagues in terms of structuring the rents are that, we're just paying ourselves an arbitrary amount, or, we looked on Google 15 years ago to see what was in and around the area, and we're paying ourselves $15 a square foot, but now all of a sudden the market's at 20 and we've never adjusted, for example. Or many doctors that I speak with just say, well, I don't know, I don't even remember why I came up with that amount, but that's just what I've been paying myself for the past 15 years, right? The other most common error with structuring the rents is that you're just paying the landlord yourself to pay off the mortgage amount. Well, more often than not, the mortgage amount is going to be greater than anything that we're seeing in the market. So once again, overstating that rent and understating that income. And with that in mind, as we're looking at rents, we will also want to take a look at what is the best rent for you, right? And now these are the three main types of lease. The first is what is referred to as a gross lease. And now what this is, it's simply just a lump sum amount that we're consistently paying ourselves each and every month. So let's say every single month I'm paying myself $3,000. That's it. Now, this is great because it's extraordinarily simplistic. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. We always know what we're going to be receiving, either for yourself as the owner occupant or yourself down the road as the landlord. It's very easy. Unfortunately, where the pitfall of the gross lease is within the fact that there are always variable costs to running and maintaining your building. Right? If the pipe breaks, if we need to re-roof, if we have to redo the fascia of the building, all of these additional expenses crop up. But who's paying for that? If we have any major damages to the building and we're only paying ourselves that couple $1,000s a month, typically speaking, you as the landlord are going to have to start paying out of pocket in order to cover the cost of that. Not the practice if we're on a gross lease, because now there's a convolution of where the money is coming from. The next is a modified gross lease. Now, this is sort of the hybrid model between the gross lease, the modified, and the triple net lease. And one way to describe this is essentially you're taking the gross lease amount, you're always paying yourself that $3,000, but in addition to that, you're also paying your proportionate share. Typically, it's going to be the proportionate share of insurance and taxes. So whatever the property taxes are and the property insurance that you're responsible for as a tenant, even though it's within your building, you're going to be paying a proportionate share of that. However, the pitfall to this, as the same as the gross lease, is that once again, we're not covering any of the costs for maintenance or repairs to the building. We're only covering insurance and taxes. Now, where that is beneficial is that, as I'm sure many of you can attest to as well, is that we've seen a great deal of increases through property taxes and insurances over the past 5 to 10 years. And that can help mitigate some of that loss or some of that exposure in comparison to the gross lease, but it's still not capturing everything. All right. Now, the triple net lease, where this differs from the other two, is that this is all encompassing, right? So you have yourself as the tenant or your future tenant paying a base rent plus triple net. So what that is plus taxes, maintenance, and insurance. So you're going to be paying the property taxes on the building, just as the modified gross. You're going to be paying your insurances, just as the modified gross. But you're also going to be paying for the maintenance, operations, and repairs of the building as well. Now, obviously, where this is much more beneficial is the fact that you as the landlord are never going to have to be paying out of pocket. You're always going to have your tenant covering the cost for the maintenance of the building itself, right? Now, where this does fall short is for any of you that are more interested in a simplistic lease, very little calculations. Frankly, the triple net lease isn't the best lease for you. There are going to be more calculations here. There's going to be a lot more thought surrounding what we're actually responsible to pay for and how that breakdown works each and every month, right? And that can become tedious, but like I said, what that does ensure on the back end may be a little bit more pain and suffering in the beginning, but in the long run, it's always going to make sure that you're covering the cost of running and maintaining your building, which is more important. But ultimately, these are the three main types of leases, and it's up to you. And what my team does for many of your colleagues is we work with you on what makes the most sense for you. How does that work? And showing you exactly what you're responsible for through the lease agreement as well, right? Through the triple net component, you have to ensure that we're delineating exactly what is the landlord responsibility versus what is the tenant responsibility when it comes to any of the maintenance, repairs, or damages to the building itself. Now, the other main component of the lease agreement and why it is so important surrounds the selling of your practice, right? Now, first and foremost is the sufficient term and options that are needed. Now, what do the financial institutions require these days? Well, right as it stands today, they need anywhere between around 10 years worth of term on the lease agreement in order for you to receive, or your buyer to receive, a loan in order for the acquisition of the practice. Right? Now, if we're on a lease where we're just renewing or auto-renewing each and every year that you may have structured today, well, that's not enough term for an incoming buyer to have in order to receive a loan, right? Or if we have a lease where we're running out of options or running out of term, it's important that it's structured properly and maintained properly over your tenancy and ownership to ensure that any of those buyers can receive the necessary finances to acquire your practice. Now, in conjunction with that, of course, we also have the history of the lease. Now, I've had many doctors ask, okay, what happens if I'm planning on selling my practice tomorrow? What do we do? And that's a great question. And the history of the lease is very important. It's not the be all and end all, but it can help you receive greater value for the practice and more interest in the practice as well. Because if we're in a situation where we only have this brand new lease from 6 months ago to when the buyer comes in, what they're going to be looking at and taking an extra careful look at is the financials that your practice has been paying to yourself as the landlord. And in some scenarios, what I have seen is there's a devaluation that occurs in terms of practice price because there wasn't that proven track record on the lease. We've seen an increase in expenditures, and as we saw that increase in expenditures because of the low release rate, that we're seeing a decrease in collections. And that can become problematic because not only is there that difference, yes, okay, rent expenses went up, but is it something else? And then there's an error of skepticism surrounding your practice and that acquisition, right? And really what this gives you as an advantage is the ability to have that lease agreement, keep it in the drawer, and continue onward with your tenancy. And with that proven track record and history, it just shows that the practice was always able to comfortably handle the debt obligations that it had. It also shows that it's been extraordinarily successful. It has gone with annual increases, the margins, consumer price index, you name it. It just shows the true success of the practice while also meeting the obligations, showing any incoming buyer that they can do it too. This is what we've been doing, and this is how we've been successful. Now, once again, looking at the rental rates, going back to the rents. Well, what impact do the rental rates have in terms of the sale of the practice? Well, once again, if we're vastly overpaying ourselves in rent, or even just slightly above market in rent, if I'm a buyer, and put yourself in the buyer's shoes, if you were evaluating two practices, two veterinary practices, both producing around the same amount, and one has a rent of $3,000 a month, and one has a rent of $7,000 a month, you're probably more likely to go for the $3,000 a month rent, unless there's some very large extenuating circumstance that's over here. But if we are having rental rates that are vastly above market, it's going to cause a vast majority of your buyers to lose interest in the practice and look elsewhere. Additionally, going back to the history of the lease, if they see that large fluctuation in the lease and in the lease rate itself, that gives some buyers some uncertainty there regarding, if you've just done that increase, are you going to do it again soon? What does that look like for me? And once again, that overall air of skepticism surrounds the practice. So it's crucial that we have the rental rates in line with market so that we attract, number one, the most buyers, and that we can ensure we're that much more attractive ourselves as an acquisition. And then there's consent language. Now, this is something that many of you probably have not thought of in terms of the sale of the practice. Now, unfortunately, what we've seen is with many of the newer veterinarians that are graduating from college or from the or recent associates and beyond, they're going into private practice. And unfortunately, a vast majority don't understand how much work actually goes in to running and maintaining a veterinary practice. I mean, I was dealing with a veterinarian just outside of Reno, and with his practice, he had sold and had a buyer come in, retained ownership of the space, and within 3 years, that buyer said, you know what, this is way more work than I thought it was going to be. I'm going back to be an associate. I don't want to do this anymore. And they sold the practice. Now, unfortunately, this individual did not have proper control through the lease agreement itself to dictate who could come in to the space as a buyer. And unfortunately, he had this other individual come in. They practiced in the space for a year and ultimately defaulted on the lease agreement. Now, this could all be controlled by yourselves through the lease so that you can see how much time has to go by, what language do you get to put in here to control who can come into the space and who can leave. Because we don't want to be in a situation in which the buyer comes in, they start practicing, and ultimately they walk away and leave you with your hand open, and we've lost months on end of rental rates. Right? It's unfortunately a lot more common than you think it is, and ensuring you have that control through that process is absolutely crucial to your residual income in retirement and your overall stress levels in retirement as well. Right? So really some questions to think of for yourself is, how much control do you want to retain? Do you want to keep your hooks into any buyers if they are to sell again? And really, what happens post-sale? How do you want that space to be run? Are there certain controls that you want to have in place that need to be listed out through the lease? I mean, again, dealing with a doctor just in Austin, she sold her practice, she went on vacation and came back to the clinic, and the walls were painted fluorescent pink. Now, as a landlord, I'm sure many of you might be furious at that idea, but unfortunately, through their lease, they didn't have any language protecting them from that, and they just had to let the space continue to be, that fluorescent awful pink that they hated so much. So a lot of this has to do with, not only do we want to think about how can we protect ourselves today, but how can we protect ourselves through the sale of the practice and beyond. So the next component is increasing the property value itself. So as I mentioned earlier on, the property value is predicated on the lease agreement itself, right? When anybody is evaluating the lease, when they're taking a look at the property itself, commercial real estate is all viewed as an income property. So if you have a lease agreement in place where you're vastly underpaying yourself, then the property becomes less attractive, right? Now they're looking at that and saying, well, that's not really enough money for us to continue moving forward. On the other hand of that is if we have a lease agreement where we're paying ourselves an exorbitant amount of money, they look at that and they go, okay, well, that's all well and good right now, but nobody else is going to come into the space and pay that amount of money for this location, right? So once again, keeping that within that fair market value, that lease agreement, and the contingencies and language that are listed within it are just as important, because ultimately any of the landlords or individuals that are going to be coming in and acquiring the property are going to want to make sure that they have as much control over the space as possible. Now, once again, looking at the leasing history, as we just touched on, why is this important? Well, quite simply, because if you're evaluating a property, if you're taking a look at how long this has been here and how much rent has been paid, the longer track record that you can show that, hey, for the past 20 years, this is what's being paid to us as the landlord, that is much more attractive to them, because not only are they able to see previous income from this location, but it also gives them the ability to look at future projections as well. So that leasing history and that term and options, such as the length of the lease, all tie in together to continuously add on to the value of the practice itself, and of course onto the value of the property. Now, with looking at the rental rates, as I touched on, all predicated on the lease, this all comes in line, and the length of the lease as well, very important. The longer term that is listed on the lease, the more recognizable revenue any future buyer of the property has the ability to see. So if you have something like a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options, you're giving 20 years worth of continuity and foreseeability, and immediately 10 years worth of recognizable revenue for any incoming buyer of the property itself, right? Options to renew tie hand in hand, as I mentioned, those 2 5-year options. Now, options to renew can be structured in any way that you want them to be. Typically speaking, as I mentioned earlier, financial institutions need 10 years worth of term. Typically, we want to match the amount of term we're granting on the lease with the amount of options as well, right? It just keeps the calculations easy for yourself as the landlord, giving yourself continuous renewal options, continuously restructuring, etc. But once again, the longer term on the lease agreement and the more history that we have on the back end, the much higher your property is going to be valued at itself. Now, as we're looking through here and looking at the lease agreement, these are a number of additional components in which we have to be aware of and cognizant of as a landlord and as the property and practice owner, right? So as we're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, the sale of the practice, That's here where we're looking at the assignment provision, right? So this is the section of the lease that dictates who can come into the space, who can leave, and overall what your parameters are as the landlord in that situation. Are you just letting anybody come in to the space and take over? Probably not going to be the case, right? Typically, we want to ensure that we're bringing in a very qualified candidate into our space, right? Other components of that as well. Are we comfortable with them having associates come into the space? How do we want to deal with any of the subtenants? If they want to bring some tenants into the space, how do we want that to be written into the lease? Is that something that we want to approve as the landlord? Is that something that we're happy with them bringing in anybody? Usually we want some form of control there, but it's very important that we put that in writing so that in the event that they bring in somebody else that we're not happy with or start subleasing your space, that we're clearly outlining exactly what's supposed to happen in that event. One of the other main components that's often overlooked is the surrender clause. Now, you as the landlord have a lot of control in that perspective on what you want to do with the space if your tenant and buyer should ever pick up and leave. What do you want that to look like? Are you comfortable with them taking anything and everything out of the space? Is it something where there's specific items in which you want them to leave in the space? Or do you want to have as much control as saying, okay, well, you're leaving, I want everything out of the space and bring it back to, a gray shell or original condition or pre-veterinary condition? Because in some instances, that can be not only a very attractive component for yourselves, if you decide for whatever reason you no longer want a veterinary practice in the space, that you have the ability to change that up and have the tenant pay for it. Or you, on the other hand, if they are to leave, relocate, or for whatever reason, you can keep a lot of the improvements and alterations and additions there and ensure that you're marketing essentially a fully built out veterinary practice that you can charge slightly above market rates for. Other components such as damage and destruction. Now, what this has to deal with, just as it says in the name, is that what happens if there's a tree to fall, any act of God, fire, anything like that, that damages the building? What are your obligations as the landlord at that point in time? Is this something where if it's 50% destroyed, it's not worth it for you to rebuild and put the tenant back in there? Is it something where it's only 25% destroyed and you're okay to rebuild? But all of that needs to be delineated into the lease, because a situation that one of my other doctors was in just outside of Boston was, unfortunately, a tree fell and crashed right through the clinic itself. Fortunately, nobody was in the practice. It happened at night, but looking through the lease agreement, his tenant demanded that they redo the space. And based off of the tree falling, it was a significant amount of damage. It was not reasonable to rebuild. It was actually going to cost much more than he was going to be receiving in rent over the next couple of years. But unfortunately, the way that the damage and destruction clause was written into the lease agreement, he had to rebuild the entire building itself just to lease it out again, instead of just cutting his losses or finding somebody else to do something with that. Right? Another component that's often overlooked, but incredibly important for your long-term goals. Now, other things such as I mentioned, improvements and alterations, this goes back to how much control do we want to have over our space if you're moving into that landlord position. Right? Well, this has to do with, can somebody make structural changes to the building? Probably not something that we want to happen. Is this something where they can make superficial changes such as carpeting, painting, and beyond? This isn't an easily answered question, quite frankly, because typically speaking, there's going to be some emotional attachment to the building itself, to the property. It was your veterinary practice. You have a certain flow and way that you want it to look. But unfortunately, more often than not, your buyer is going to disagree with something and somewhere. So ensuring that you're clearly outlining what can happen into your space is crucial, because if for whatever reason somebody decides they want to move a demising wall or want to completely change the layout of the space, well, what does that look like for you? Is that something that through the lease agreement is able to happen? If they move one of those demising walls and all of a sudden the roof caves in, but there was no language in the lease agreement saying they couldn't do that, well, what situation are we now in? Right? Typically now it's all going through insurance. It takes a number of years. There can be incompetence and beyond, because that also falls into who do we want to be able to come in and make those changes to the space. Right? We want to ensure that it has to be a qualified individual, not just Joe Handyman coming in and making all those changes how he sees fit, when in actuality, it could be a breach of code, the Americans with Disabilities Act. All of those come into play, and those are all components that we need to keep in mind as eventual landlords, and even for yourselves as owner occupants, keeping in mind that all of the Americans with Disability Acts guidelines and restrictions need to be followed. And through the lease agreement, important to delineate who's responsible for that once again. Now, some of the other components here as well are demolition, relocation clauses. That just gives it more control to you as the landlord. Demolition clauses essentially give you the right to terminate the lease agreement in the event that you no longer want to have this be a veterinary clinic and you want to undergo some form of redevelopment. Typically, this can be an aspect of the lease that's very attractive for potential property acquisitions. However, there is a trade-off with that. Once again, looking at that dial, are we fully landlord friendly? Are we fully tenant friendly? Demolition clauses are absolutely on the very landlord friendly side. Yes, they can increase some of the attractiveness of the building itself and of the property, but the trade-off for that is it could be hindering or harming any of your tenants, or at least the tenant's interest in acquiring the practice or staying long term. Right? Now, other components as well would be options such as the right of first refusal. Now, the right of first refusal can be structured in a multitude of different ways, but something like the right of first refusal to purchase. So any of you around that contemplation of the sale of the practice, as we're looking forward, what rights do we want to give any potential buyer in terms of acquiring the real estate, if any? Right? Obviously, it's not something that has to be in the lease, but it can be quite a great value add for any incoming buyer to see, hey, maybe one day I can acquire the building as well. And with that property acquisition, sometimes we can see an increase in property value and practice value. But one key component there with the right of first refusal to purchase is that's entirely in your hands as the landlord, as the owner occupier. That if you want to put it up on the market, you have the ability to do so. You just have to ask the buyer or the tenant rather, if they're interested first, or if in some other situations, if there's somebody that's coming along and wanting to acquire your property and the building, you have to give your tenant the right of first refusal, so yes or no, to the acquisition of the building prior to moving forward on any sale to an outside third party. Now, once again, it's critical that this section of the lease is structured properly. I've seen in some circumstances where it's structured incorrectly and the landlord unfortunately has lost money. I was speaking with a doctor in Georgia, and unfortunately what happened with her was whomever had structured their lease originally, when she had somebody come forward, give her an offer to acquire the building, and they were offering her about $1.8 million. That was the asking price. And it was on a very large piece of land, and they were going to redevelop it for townhouses and condos. Well, unfortunately, the way that her right of first refusal was structured in the lease, gave the tenant the ability to only pay market value. Well, the market value for the space was about $1 million. But this investor was coming in very heavy-handedly, wanting to get through to that property and build this massive development. That was what they were willing to pay for it. And unfortunately, the tenant was able to buy the practice and the property from the doctor, and ultimately the doctor, who was the landlord at that point in time after selling their practice, lost over $600,000 just because of that section alone, right? So it's a great thing to have in there, don't get me wrong, but it's extraordinarily important that it's properly structured through the lease agreement as well. We don't want to be in any situations where, you know, we're going to be losing money because something wasn't worded correctly, right? Number of other provisions, but those are the main ones that I did want to take some additional time to discuss with you all as well. Now, as we've talked quite a bit about rental rates this evening, really how we can help with that is we have access to over 95 billion square feet of commercial real estate data, over 1.5 million verified listings. And what this helps us have the ability to do is that when we're speaking with yourselves, when we're helping to structure those leases for you, and even on our initial calls, we can help you really get down into the minutia of the market and what the rental rates are looking like for you in and around the area. Because like I said, the large portion of the property value and of the practice value is predicated on the lease rates. And this is how we can be of assistance with each and every one of you on how we can help you with the lease rates, and how to get those rents properly structured, especially in terms of your market, what are the variables, vacancies, and beyond. And what that does is just helps give you all more knowledge on exactly how that works. Now, as a thank you to everybody in attendance tonight, now we offer something called a critical dates and risk analysis. And now this is typically something that's a $1,995 value, where I'll spend time personally with each and every one of you, about 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease. And now for any of you that don't have a lease agreement in place today, what we do is we go through our due diligence, take a look at the property. You and I will speak, we'll get a better understanding of your commercial real estate needs and your situation in greater detail. Then we'll go through a call to cover your vision plans, strategies over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And any of the traps that may be uncovered through the lease agreement you may have today, or you may not have today, or how you're structuring your rents, and working with you to understand what the ideal lease should look like for you. Now, like I said, this is typically a $1,995 value, but as a thank you to everyone in attendance this evening, I'll be putting this as a complimentary status. So for any of you that are interested, please feel free to schedule a complimentary lease consultation or real estate consultation with myself. I'd be more than happy to speak with each and every one of you. And we'll just pull up a quick poll here as well, just for some closing thoughts. And I know that we covered a great deal of information tonight, but please feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the Q&A slot. I'd be more than happy to address them here this evening. Excellent. So my first question that I have here is from Dr. K. So Dr. K is asking, how do I know if the rental rates are going to be increasing over the next couple of years? So, it's a great question, Dr. K. As we look through and we look at the commercial real estate trends in the market, it's very, very common that we're going to see increases year over year. And really a way to ensure that you keep that in line is, number one, taking a look through what I can do for you, be more than happy to connect afterwards, is take a look through the commercial real estate trends, where we've seen the rental rates go over the past couple months and how that trajectory looks. And also, there's multiple ways to structure those rents, whether that's on a rent schedule, annual increases, and beyond. More than happy to get into that in further detail. Now, the other question I have here from Dr. Lee is how does the lease agreement carry through post-sale? So I'm going to make a slight assumption there, Dr. Lee, that you mean if we're to retain ownership of the building and sell the practice itself. Well, how that works and what we're able to do is you essentially are assigning the lease from yourself to an incoming buyer, or through the lease agreements that we create for our tenants, we're able to just transfer those over to an incoming buyer. So with that in mind, looking at how that works for you, we just need to see exactly what your time frame looks like, because that's very important. Like I said, term, options on the lease, ensuring that that's all in line with each other, very important to take a look at. And as we're looking through that, ensuring that those are all transferred, such as personal guarantees, such as the amount of time left on the lease. All of that needs to take place as we look through that agreement. But typically it's through an assignment of the lease and keeping yourself as the landlord over here. And another question that I have here as well is about that right of first refusal reference. So that was, as I mentioned, that was the section of the lease that had to take place, and unfortunately, the landlord was taken for a bit of a ride by their tenant. Well, so like I said, it's ensuring that the language isn't improperly structured. So unfortunately for that individual, it just stated that it had to be at the fair market value. Well, that's fine. That's something we would rather put into something like a right to purchase, where your tenant has the ability to buy the practice from you. That's fine. That's good to have in there for some. Not all want that, because usually it just kicks in after a certain time period, such as I'm your new tenant. 5 years from now, I'll be coming forward and offering to buy the building, and that has to be at fair market value. And while that's fine, it doesn't work for a right of first refusal, because you will sometimes get those bullish offers. And with that, we need to ensure that we keep that so that we're protected and make sure that we can keep the most amount of money at the end of that term. I have another question here. Solo practitioner and the business is sole proprietorship. Do not have a lease agreement with myself. My son will be joining with the intent of buying in the next couple of years. Is there still an advantage to starting a lease? Absolutely there is. So, I'd be more than happy to discuss in greater detail offline. But as we're looking through and seeing what this looks like for you, is if your son is joining, we still need to know what the transition plans look like through the actual property itself. I'm not sure of the specific situation. Like I said, I'd be more than happy to speak with you in greater detail about this. But if they're looking at acquiring the building as well, or is that something we're going to be passing down through trust, estate, familial sale, any of those options can all be factored in. But even if for whatever reason you decide that we're going to sell the building to somebody else, or quite frankly, maybe your son doesn't want to have the responsibility of ownership of a property and would rather just focus on his veterinary career, which is fairly common. It just making sure those two are separate, because what we also want to ensure is that there are multiple avenues at all junctures. If anybody needs to transition and go down a different avenue, absolutely, it's important that there's a lease agreement in place from that perspective. But also, as I mentioned earlier, when we're looking at the lease, separation of those entities, who is the practice, who is the landlord, and if somebody's to trip and fall, any leaks, breakages, anything like that where somebody is hurt in that process, we need to say whose responsibility is what, because like I said, we don't want to have a situation where they're coming after, the veterinary clinic itself, which usually has more assets in it, rather than a situation where they're coming after whatever the holding corporation or the holding corporation or shell corp that's ownership of the building is there, because that's typically a lot less in value than what we're going to be dealing with in terms of what we have in the practice. I hope I answered that question for you as well, Doctor. There's a couple of unknowns through there, so like I said, I'd be more than happy to address that further with you as well. Perfect. Well, I wanted to thank everyone again for attending this evening's webinar. We're just under 9 o'clock Eastern here. And I just have a last minute question here from Dr. Young-Ju. I'm happy to answer. I have 2 5-year terms to renew based on fair market value. Does this mean the renew is guaranteed without increasing the rental cost unreasonably higher? The landlord support from the building improvement is not great. So, Dr. Ju, it does depend on the option to renew language there. So depending on how that's been structured previously, that will dictate what those options to renew look like. In addition, if the landlord support for the building improvement has not been great, now I'm not sure, it sounds like to me that you're a tenant in the building dealing with a landlord. If I'm incorrect, please feel free to let me know. But if that is the case, seeing what needs to be done and taking a look in the lease agreement on what the improvements are surrounding in that lease clearly is very important. But in terms of those 2 5-year renewal options, it doesn't mean so the landlord is trying to keep the grandfather rule. Okay, so with that can be a little trickier. I'd be more than happy, Dr. Ju, if you would like to take that offline. Be more than happy. You can see my number at the bottom, or you can feel free to email me at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. I'll be more than happy to schedule a call with you either tomorrow or over the weekend or in through the next week. Be more than happy to talk about this further with you. Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Ju.
Right. Thank you so much, Matthew, for your presentation and all the expertise you brought to everyone today. Thank you to Cirrus and Covetrus for sponsoring today's webinar. And thank you to all of our webinar participants. When you exit the webinar, you will see a survey. Please complete every form field. And remember, we manually process those continuing education certificates, so you won't get it right away, but you will get it in your email sometime in the next week or so. So thank you so much. This ends our webinar presentation.